What's up, everybody? It must be Tuesday because we're here for another episode of Beyond 2D. I'm one of your hosts, Jessica Dugas, and this is my other.
I'm still in the intro. Farron is still in the intro.
We were dancing.
Run that back. Can you run that 30 seconds back?
Nope, but it was good.
It was good.
It's always a vibe. Listen, I got a lot of compliments. The last couple of weeks, actually, I was doing a lot of recordings for some other shows, and people were like, "Man, like the intros and the graphic," and I'm like, "Listen, I can't help it.
I'm telling you,
I like to have a dance party because it gets me in the vibe for being on for the camera here."
Yeah, well, I'm a little jelly because I don't have that on my other shows.
Well, I know someone who can.
Do you know someone?
I do. I
do. Talk to her.
Miss Brittany's in the front row this morning. She's ready to get her boundaries conversation on this evening. I'm very excited about that.
Taking down boundaries today, baby.
We have talked, since the show started about a lot of different things: communication, trust, integrity, just so many things. And it's been a fun little ride. And we asked a couple weeks ago, we asked everybody, what topics would you like to see? And one of the ones that kept coming up when I would ask people, and then in the comments on that show, was boundaries. And there's a few other things that came up that I think the boundaries is going to tie into a little bit when we talk about things like forgiveness, and just a lot of different things. So the next 4 weeks, next 4 episodes, we are going to be talking about boundaries. This week, we are talking about unveiling the language of boundaries. We're going to be talking about what the word means, like literally, figuratively, what it means individually to each person. Next episode, we're going to be talking about navigating interpersonal boundaries. So what boundaries look like in relationships and how that may help or hurt you. The third one, we're going to talk about cultural boundaries and embracing diversity. That should be an interesting topic. And then finally, I'm excited about week 4, actually, because we're going to be talking about pushing limits, overcoming self-imposed boundaries. A lot of times, we create boundaries for ourselves that aren't exactly the most healthy things, and we hold ourselves back from what's possible. So I'm excited to dive into it all. And are you? It's going to be a good time, I think.
Hey, like I said, we may not be friends after this episode, but we'll work it out on episode number 2.
Nah. We'll still be friends. It'll all be good, because I think part of what I'm excited about this series is seeing what boundaries signifies and means to other people, because that's really what we're talking about here. And I think this topic ties beautifully to the conversations that we've had about communication. Because that's where it's at. So we're gonna dive. I'm gonna start kick it up. We're gonna do what we usually do when we broach a new topic, and that's talk about the actual dictionary definition of.
Let's go, baby.
So let's start with that. The definition of boundary, plural boundary, it's a noun, person, place, or thing. For those of us who need a little grammar school here for a moment, something that indicates bounds or limits, a limiting or bounding line. So super simple. There was one definition. That's it. Unless we're talking about math, because boundaries in math is a whole function, something or other that we're not getting into on the show today. Then when we talk about the synonyms: barrier, border, borderline, bounds, confines, edge, frontier, horizon, line, and perimeter. Those are some of the
Mhm.
synonyms of
Barriers,
boundaries.
mhm,
Hmm.
borderlines,
Yep. Yep.
mhm, edges.
So, okay. So, why don't you start out by telling everybody how you really feel about about the word boundary? When
Let
you hear
me grab my microphone.
the word boundary, tell me what you picture in your head.
Wow. So in the context of boundaries outside of myself, they're like barricades, things that you set up around your house. Military wise, we set up boundaries to keep the enemy out. You set up boundaries to keep the cats and the animals in your neighborhood out. Like, to me,
Mm,
they're physical. They're actually physical boundaries that you can see and touch and move around.
yeah.
That's what I believe that definition is pointing to.
Mm,
Is not the definition of that what we're talking about.
mm,
It's totally different. So yeah, boundaries are physical, things that you can put out in place that you can see, touch, move around, feel, and they're protecting you from something. Initially, it's a protection. Why else
right.
would you have boundaries unless you're trying to protect yourself from some outside force?
Right. Right.
Physically.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think so when we go back, I went to look at the history or the origin of the word boundary, and came from a boundary stone. It was an old French and English, they would call it a boundary stone, and it was a stone to mark the boundary of a property. So
Mm,
it ties into what you were talking about it having a very physical meaning. It was to mark who owned what land.
mhm.
And then we think of, so there's an interesting tie there to ownership as well, that I think we'll address
Oh,
eventually.
that's definitely that's the definition we want right there.
um and then, I think we over time those boundaries changed, right? So, the population increased, and people were divvying out more land, so we needed to do more than just a little stone. There were fences, there were walls, there were gates, there were, all of these things to create that physical separation of what, to show what belongs to whom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the physical boundaries that in that context, for sure, we need those. We live by those. Those are identifiers. So yeah, we definitely, my fence is my boundary from my neighbor's property. I get that. It's more than just a fence. It separates our property line. So I get that part.
Yeah.
But let's move on. I'm gonna be
Fran's ready to dig into it. Fran has his fangs and nails in his little cage next to him. I don't know at what point. I mean, I think language over time, as we talk about language in general, like a lot of things started out as a physical definition of, and then, you and I talked about, on, I can't remember which show it was at this point, but we were talking about um when you say like that someone hurts you
right.
in some kind of way, like how that what are you really saying there? Because when you say like, it makes my, for example, it makes my stomach turn, well, what does that mean? Or you're giving me a heart attack, like what does that actually mean when we say those things? And so I think over time with language, we've taken things that start with a physical definition of, and we've taken them and applied them to the spiritual, the mental, the emotional. And because things that we are able to see, we're
Mhm.
able to relate to a little better than to come up with something that maybe doesn't have that physical, that we're able to understand better. So I'm not sure at what point in history we started saying, I'm going to create a boundary, meaning something invisible rather than that physical wall.
So what I've learned over these last, I have to say these last 13 years, because I wasn't in this mind frame my whole life, right? I
Mm,
had to get educated. I had to, do a lot of self work, personal development, spiritual, all that. So what I've gathered for myself, where I found my peace and boundaries, is that it comes from the human experience, right? And we discount the experience of human beings, right? We say we care about how you feel and what you think and your
Mm.
emotions, but we really discount the power of the human experience. And I believe that it's always been there. And as our generations have grown and things have changed, they become more and more prevalent because of the pains, the different things of past generations experiences. And so we're so protective of ourselves, we think, in
Right.
language. And so our language describes our world and how we talk. And some of the words that we use in our language as a description aren't necessarily the truth in the experience of us, which
Mm.
is why you said what you said about you making me sick, you making me this, you doing like.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, there's a human experience and there's a human activity. And that's how I've been able to find peace in my own life in this journey. I have an experience of life and I have an activity of life. And
Right.
sometimes I try to use my words to describe that activity, which it may not fit what I'm doing because I don't really, or I haven't researched the actual word that best fits what I'm doing or what I'm describing. So
Mm.
that's why I believe the dictionary is so important, because we grew up in our environment. Our environment teaches us how to survive this life. And sometimes we use words that don't really, you know, fit the description of what we're dealing with. And then when you're growing up in your environment as a child and your parent says, oh, or someone in your family says, oh, what are you? Are you stressing? Oh, what's stress? Oh, well, so now I'm 7 or 8 or 5, and now you just giving me this body sensation of what now I'm gonna call stress for the rest of my life. So when I feel this,
Mm.
oh yeah, my aunt told me that was stress,
Right.
right? So
Right.
I believe that that's how it gets passed on in language, and we really have to understand how powerful our words are and what we say, and boundaries. I discovered for myself. Um, I don't use that frame or term in my life anymore, because as we'll get into it, it's very limiting. And
Mm.
I know why I made up my boundaries. Like I discovered where my boundaries came from,
Right.
and I was able to be like, okay, no, those they might feel good, but they really don't serve me because they're so limiting to who I say that I am as a person if I live from my boundaries. So
Right. Right.
that's where I believe it comes from. And I ask people to look in your life. We call it an empirical truth. You don't have to Google it. Just search your mind, search your heart, and figure out what that looks like for you. And
Mm.
that could be your truth right there. So
Yeah. And I think, that was one of the things that I realized when I watched how you were triggered by that word when we brought it up on air initially.
yeah.
My immediate thought was, Farron and I have a very different idea of what the definition of boundaries is or what that looks like to each of us. And I don't think either one is right or wrong per
Yeah.
se. It just depends on our perception of what it is. I will say, when I was younger, I really viewed it as I viewed a boundary as a hard stop, a wall,
Mm.
bricks. This is when it's done, kind of thing. And then I had my eyes open, probably um going back about 12 years or so. I had a set of affirmation cards that I had gotten from the amazing Lynn Thurman, who has been on the Breakthrough Show. And they're called Sea Whispers. And I just love them because they really spoke to me about, like, just feeling good about myself and where I'm at. And the one card said net, and the definition of this card with the net on it had to do with boundaries,
Mm.
creating boundaries. And I said to myself, now a net is not going to keep out much of anything, because but that's the point. that's the point of the net being the boundary. It's to stop viewing boundaries as this hard stop brick wall and see it rather as a net that can still allow life to flow through. You can still see to the other side of things. You can still have the ability for air and life and all of that to come through. But it is a method of being able to keep ourselves safe as well. And so I think about boundaries for me when I'm thinking about um, those relationships that we're going to talk about next week. There are, as an intuitive, there are spiritual boundaries that I like to place around myself. I even think about my good friend Linda Spain, who's passed on. She used to get up every morning and go through the entire armor of God with herself, and she would go through the
You
whole
would put on
thing,
the
and
breastplate of righteousness and the helmet
and
of
she would
salvation.
do the motions,
Yeah.
she would really feel that, and that's for her. be- Going back to how we need sometime that physical representation as humans to mean something to us. Was she actually putting on armor? Absolutely not. But that physical motion of putting on the breastplate of righteousness, and all of the different pieces, it was so powerful to her that she was absolutely creating that spiritual boundary for herself, that protection, that safety. And so I can't, I think we'll learn as the weeks go on that it, for me, it really depends on the circumstances, the person, the situation, the whole deal as to what that word means. But that's where communication comes into play as well.
Yeah, and that so when I did my research, the first thing that I found about boundaries was fractured integrity.
Mm, interesting.
And so when I saw fractured integrity, I'm like, there it is right there. Like the show's over. The
Now,
show's over.
now you're going to have to explain to me where that comes from, fractured integrity, and what that has to do with boundaries.
Because so if my word is integrity, if I'm living in integrity,
Mm,
I'm I'm being responsible, I'm accountable. All the words, all the things that we use, I'm in communication based on my integrity of myself. My integrity is that I'm gonna do what I say when I said I was gonna do it by when I'm gonna do it. Like that's
mm-hmm,
me honoring my word. And that's challenging for human beings. It's already challenging for me to honor my word to myself, let alone trying to honor my word to you, right? So as I'm living my life, and I whatever age I experience that diminishedness of myself, of my integrity, because I'm whatever that childhood emotional trauma was, it's already thwarted,
mm,
right? So I'm growing up and I'm guarded because there's something wrong here. I don't belong. I'm on my own. Like those thwart our ability to having full integrity because now I've given my power to an outside force.
mm,
So now I'm growing up and I have this diminished experience of myself. And now people hurt me. People, my mom hurt me. My dad, this. I'm like outside forces. And when you talk about it from that perspective, it's not real
mm,
because my interpretation, my perception of what happened to me as a child was my perception. It wasn't the truth. My mom never abandoned me. My dad did love me, but whatever that incident that fractured my integrity as a child, I lived from that, and
mm.
that became part of my survival. Now I got to survive, right? So now we're talking about living life and surviving life. If I'm living life, I don't need boundaries. If
Right.
I'm living in integrity, I don't need boundaries because I'm going to be responsible. If you get mad at me, or if I do something and you say, "Hey, Farron, you hurt my feelings," please, what did I say? And if
Yeah.
and if that if we talk from that and you still say, "Well, Farron, you hurt me, you disappointed me, I don't want to be your friend no more. We're done.
Hmm.
Don't ever call me, don't speak to me." I have to be okay with that for my
Right.
integrity. I take
Right.
responsibility for that. If I said something to you and you took it that way, and that's a consequence for my behavior,
Right.
I'm gonna take that. I'll say, you know what, But forgive me, I didn't mean it that way, but I understand if that's how you feel about it, I'll respect that.
Right.
But that's still no boundaries. So I believe that the boundaries are generated or they come from this experience, this human experience of a fractured integrity, because integrity is everything to us.
Mm.
And so when you look from it from integrity, it's me being responsible, accountable, communicating my boundaries. Instead of me saying I'm gonna put this wall up, I'm gonna say no. I need to have a
But you
conversation.
just used the word boundaries. You
I'm
said
saying if
communicating my boundaries.
I'm saying, but if that's what we're gonna use it as a boundary, then I have to
Right.
communicate it.
Right.
And so for you, because you're the one that's listening to me, for you it might be a boundary. So I have to still be okay with boundaries because that's how you interpret. But what we're really having is we're having a conversation.
Right.
So
Right.
I can't look out the window and show you Farron's boundary. Oh, my boundary's right there in the corner. I can't show you Farron's boundary.
Right.
In
Right.
nature, in nature. I could talk about it, I could
Yeah.
describe it,
Yeah.
but I can't physically show you, here's my boundary. Don't come past this thing. Like that's it's two totally different. And that's why I believe it comes from the human experience. And
Mm.
if we tell the truth to ourselves, and we get down to the core of who we are as a person, our feelings, our emotions, and we own those, you can find your freedom. And I was able to find my peace
Mm.
in that conversation because for me, I'm accountable.
Right.
And if I'm gonna have integrity, integrity creates workability.
Right.
So that's
Right.
that's why I'm kind of in my space of, you know, I can't physically show you Farron's boundaries. I could
Mm.
talk if I talk about it and describe it to you, you might say that's not a boundary. That's something else. So
Right.
now we're gonna debate about what I say is a boundary versus what you
And
say is
see,
what a
right. I don't think that we would, I don't think that I would ever respond with that's not a boundary. I see all of what you were talking about. I was
yeah.
making out in my head, I was going, that's a boundary, that's a boundary, that's a boundary, and that one too. Oh, and that one. And because it I think sometimes there's like just like some other words that are out there, boundary has the potential to come with a negative connotation.
Mhm.
And so because how many of us enjoy being shut out?
Mhm.
How many of us enjoy being left out? How many of us enjoy having the door slammed in our face? How many of us, even if we are guilty in a situation like Farron was talking about, where someone creates that boundary and says, and expresses that boundary and says, "Oh, we are not going to be friends anymore," even if you did something, how many of us enjoy that? I don't think any of us enjoy being left out, shut out, blocked out, boundaried. I don't think any of us enjoy that. So when we
Can we
think
live right
about
there?
that,
Can we
what
live right there?
can we live
That,
right
that
where?
part of
Okay.
what you're describing about
Yep.
being left out and all
Yep.
that. I believe our previous guest from a few episodes, Caldwell Williams, talks about that.
Mm,
That is a human experience. The
yep.
experience of being excluded.
Right.
Excluded is an emotion, and that's what I'm saying. Exclusion is an emotional wound. Emotional, not
Mm,
physical, emotional.
yep.
And our emotions are connected to our character, our morals, all that stuff, our feelings, emotions. But what's underneath all that is my integrity
Right.
and me being my word. And if I'm threatened by you emotionally, then it's going to be hard for me to honor my word to you because it's already hard to honor my
Right.
word to myself too. So
Yep.
it's already there. And like I said, it's not a right or wrong conversation, but sometimes, like you said, what words are we using to describe that boundary, but then have a conversation about that, not the boundary.
Mm,
Like, and that takes courage to say,
right.
"Hey, let's talk." Like this
Right.
ain't working out.
Right.
This ain't.
Courage. And I think ultimately after I want to get to Brittany's comments and then we'll go to break. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is just the responsibility that we have behind creating boundaries or communicating boundaries as well. Brittany, is the two-part comments here. There's a few things I see when I think of a boundary, of course, on the physical aspect, but emotionally, it looks like I set up so I can learn the dislikes and likes of my partner to free myself from misplaced guilt and building my self-worth. And I think that's one of the things that I was reading an article, which will I saved it for next time because it has to do specifically with relationships, but it does talk about the self-worth and self-love that boundaries help to create for us, because especially like I was thinking about before the show, the boundary that I created for myself when I walked away from my first marriage. And there was abuse that was happening. And by me walking away, that would took a lot of self-worth and self-love to know that I did not deserve to be in that situation anymore. And it took me a long time to get to that place. But that boundary was absolutely an act of self-worth and self-love. The other thing that Brittany was talking about, lack of emotional boundaries to me is like consistently being at the mercy of others, allowing others to tell you how you should think, feel, or act instead of what you want to do deep down, which really is acting out of someone else's integrity instead of your own. So I think it's safe to say that Brittany likes to make sure she has her emotional boundaries. And so one of the things that I want to ask everybody before we go to break is about how do you express your boundaries? Because when we talked about the boundary stone, which was the original kind of where the word derived from, that little stone that said this person owns this piece of land, right? And I think as we talk about the non-physical boundaries, things like communication and self-expression, those things are the non-physical boundary stones, so how do you express to other people your boundaries, or even in situations, how do you express your boundaries? Do you have anything you want to say before we go to break, Farron?
No, I keep thinking, I think about a boundary is like a superstition. It's
Mm,
like we've heard about it, but we haven't really seen it in action for ourselves.
yeah.
And so it's like I said, to me, boundaries exist in language. However, could that boundary, and I'm listening to you share like your experience of what it took for you to come out of that relationship. To me, that was courage.
Mm,
Like that boundary stood for you as a level of confidence or courage to stand in this space. So I can get why we would say it's a because that boundary is hard,
mhm.
like it's hard rooted right there, right?
Yep.
So I could see why you know we would say a boundary in a physical sense
Mhm.
because it's then bringing us that experience of being confident and having the courage to then stand for whatever that boundary
Right.
represents in our life, right? So
Right.
I get that, and I get that sometimes those boundaries are going to hold us back ourselves too first. So
Right.
that's
Right.
that's the part we got to be able to be aware of, and we'll get to that later. But is
Yeah.
that boundary that I'm putting up trying to protect me from you? What is that doing to myself? Then also
Right.
at the same time, because now I'm also guarded myself from something from myself too. So
Mm,
that's the
yeah.
two side of that boundary.
There's a lot of things I think I boundaries with caution. I think with because you have to, even in the physical sense, you have to think of, and again we'll get in more of this later, but you have to think of what happens when we build a physical boundary, a wall. There are certain places, for example, on earth that are protected land, because if you build things, it disrupts the ecosystem that's going on there. It ruins the life that's trying to happen, the land. So you have to understand that just like physical boundaries, that the non-physical boundaries that we're creating have consequences. And that's something that we need to think about. I'm going to create a firm boundary, and we're going to go to break now. So we'll be right back after this. Don't go anywhere.
No.
Yes, we're going. Goodbye.
No.
Hey, what's up, man? How you doing?
I'm blessed, my brother. How you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Hey, did you see the game last night?
Oh, that was a good game.
But did you see the shot?
I lost money from that shot.
Oh, man, that shot was cold,
I
man.
hated it, but it was good. Damn. What's in those jeans?
You really want to know?
I do.
Exhaustion, muscle spasms, asthmatic issues, unexpected sickle cell trait crises.
Damn. Are you serious? When I was young, I found out I had sickle cell trait. My mom's told me, but I ain't have no knowledge of it. But when I got older, I had a child, and the doctor told me my daughter has sickle cell trait. Do you know the facts that both parents have sickle cell trait? There's a 50% chance the child may have the trait, and 25% chance the child may have the disease.
Hey, that's what's the count. Do you know that 2.5 million people in the United States have sickle cell trait, 300 million people globally? I didn't find out I had sickle cell trait until I was in the Army, 10 years. Next thing you know, I had a sickle cell trait exertion site.
Sickle cell? I thought that was a black gene or something.
Nah, man, the Latin community is number 2. 1 out of 36,000 babies are being born with sickle cell disease. You could be Caucasian, Mediterranean, European. You gotta know your bloodline, man.
There is an inherited gene in our community that has been forgotten. The name is sickle cell trait. WDCONSCT, also known as What's the Count, is out to bring awareness, education, and prevention to people all over the globe. Want more information? Call us now at 323-215-5384 or visit www.wdconsct.org.
Welcome back to Beyond 2D. We are down the rabbit hole on boundaries for the next 4 episodes. And this week we are talking about...
When I was trying to figure out what's the sound of a rabbit.
This week we are talking about unveiling the language of boundaries. Talking about the word boundaries, the origin of it, and what it means to each of us. And I would love to hear from you if you're watching the show live or on the replay. What does that word boundary mean to you? What do you see in your mind when you hear that word boundary? And what I asked before we went to break is, how do you express the boundary, the limit, the whatever it is that you're creating? How do you express that? Do you find that you're able to talk about it? Do you make a sign? Do you envision it? Do you just cut ties and put that hard wall up? Like, what does that look like for you when you need to express something, that something needs to stop, something, there needs to be an ending to something, or there needs to be a boundary created, imaginary, of course, not a physical boundary. How do you express that?
Yeah, was that for me or for the listeners?
Well, it's for the listeners, but we're going to hear from you.
Yeah, so straight up, I have by no means figured out boundaries completely, right? But the processes and the interpersonal relationship that I've gone through for myself, it still takes courage for me to stick up for myself, right? It still takes a level of courage for me to say, hey, you know what, this is unacceptable to me, so I don't have it figured out, but what I found was my peace around it, because I know that the boundaries don't give me power, like they limit me. And so by removing those boundaries from myself in language, it forces me to find the courage, like, don't put up a boundary first. No, I have to address it, right now. And it still goes back to me on how important is this boundary conversation even, because I understand we're all flawed as people. Like, nobody's perfect. Like, we have these ways that we want to be, but we have so much stuff in the way, it doesn't allow for us to be that person that we want to be, And so it's like, if I know that for myself, that gives me the grace and the mercy for other people to be themselves, right? And so instead of maybe putting up my boundary now, I may ask more questions. Like, because right away, I'm that guy that if something happens, I'll make it mean about something I did. Like, what did did I do something to you? I don't say it out loud. I don't say it out loud. I say it to myself, like, what did I do to them? So I'm going through my head.
Yeah.
Now I learned, like, hey, so is this about me? Like, I ask questions. Is this about me, or are you dealing with something in your life? And then the person will tell you, oh, this is not about you. No, this is about what happened at work today. I'm taking it out on you. Like, so then that's a different conversation. Right. I believe before I put boundaries up, or before I, use that phrase anymore, I have the courage now to say I can ask questions before I make it mean something for Ron first.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're all dealing with something. You might call me at 4:00 and I might be thinking about some stuff from the past that makes me mad, and then you think it's about you, and then you get defended because of what you feel about yourself already, right? So all that comes into play, and we haven't said a word about it to one another,
right?
So the confidence and the courage it takes to speak, and like I said, maybe ask some more questions before it mean about me, because the person will tell you, oh yeah, this is about you, Farron. This is what you did to me. So then I'm like, oh, okay, so what did I do? Right. And then now we can have that talk. So it's like I said before the break, listening to you and kind of, putting my views aside, I could hear how that boundary could also be a level of confidence or courage to stay strong,
right?
From one perspective. Yeah.
Brittany says I communicate it, and if it still continues, I'm ghost.
You know what, Brittany? We're gonna question your communication. Communication, Brittany.
See, if you, I think that's what I was looking for, honestly. Like, is if people are communicating, because before the break, when I was talking about how there are those consequences if we just rush to putting that boundary up before communicating, and I want everybody to think about it from this perspective. This is not just choosing to communicate before you implement a boundary, is not just about keeping yourself safe from the other person, because sometimes you're doing more damage to yourself. There's been times when I have in the past, like, not had that communication, not tried to reach any kind of, even if the level understanding that I'm trying to reach is that it's time to part ways, even if I haven't had that communication and I've just put up the boundaries without any answers, without any anything at all for closure, I am setting myself up for years of healing that has to be done because I've rushed to put up that wall without having a conversation first. Or without, and it's not, I think there's part of that comes from our human need to have all the answers, to know all the things and be right. We like that.
Oh yeah.
And but I think the other part too is I think it's part of our journey as humans to love and to be in relationships and to have that back and forth that needs to happen. And when we have this cutoff with nothing, then it creates a doubt, uncertainty, and all of this other guilt, grief, and all of this other stuff that we end up needing to heal from because we didn't want to have a conversation first. So I appreciate you talk about it, and then Kevin Kylie ghosted after that. Y'all, that's such a good song, by the way. Kevin, that goes so beautifully with our conversation. Ghosted by Kevin Kylie. You guys find it wherever you stream your music. Yes, getting other perspectives is important, but if it's continuously hurting you, even though you understand their perspective on it, there has to be a point where you choose yourself first.
See, bring that back up. And I'm so, as our words are powerful, and we use words to describe our life, and sometimes we use words that describe our life, and it's our own trap, right? So when I read that, but if it continuously hurting you, so what is the hurting? See, that's where you got to tell the truth to yourself and say, what part of this communication is continuing to hurt me? Not put a broad stroke pin over it. Like, that person needs to then figure out and tell that person, you're hurting me. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean to you when you're hurting me? Emotional is this, is that, it's not like, it's a description of something still that she's trying to say, but she's still not saying it. Like, we're still not saying what it is that is causing me to feel like it's still continuously hurting me. And that's the freedom that I'm saying, that if you really tell the truth to yourself first, you can tell the truth to that person and say, what you're hurting me. Well, what does that mean? Because how am I hurting you? And that's going to be their defense. And then you get to say, hey, this is emotionally draining. I'm stressing out, like, it's causing me physical pain. I'm sick to my stomach. Like, now we can start to figure out, and that gives me a better indication of what's hurting you. Because the words that we use, sometimes we describe, and it doesn't give us the freedom to say what exactly is my feeling. And if we actually got the dictionary and said, this is what hurting, this is how I feel right now, and find that word, that person will connect with that word. Oh, that's how you feel. Okay, so we could talk about that, not the label hurting me, because you're continuing hurting me. What does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Right? But we know what it means to us. But what does that mean to you? So then maybe that's something that I could quick do. It could be a quick fix. Because I didn't know I was hurting you as my behavior. Right. And then it becomes negotiable. Then it becomes, okay, then we don't need a boundary. We just need to talk about what's hurting you. So I can either, you know what? I'm just that kind of person. And then, I guess this is the consequence then. I'm not going to change. You're not going to change? Okay, so then let's go separate ways. Like, that's a better, right? Then keep saying that you're hurting me. And then I'm over here like, what am I doing?
Right.
Like,
yeah, I think we need, like, I get that, and breaking down that hurting, even because I can think of times when I've said to my husband, well, it hurts me when you say that. Well, what is hurt? Like, what, like, does it make me sad? Does it make me angry? Does it make me feel disappointed? Do I feel left out? Do I feel like breaking it down? I think is really important when it comes to those communication, because if we don't get enough details, again, we can be quick to put that wall up without anybody really understanding. Because even I can think of times in my head where I've used that word hurting, and I don't even really, like, I haven't even explored what that meant to me, and we do that sometimes. Well, we know we don't feel good, so we're like, it hurts. Okay, it hurts. Well, how? Have we explored what that hurt means for us before we're quick to be like piling up those bricks and putting it in there?
And have the confidence to communicate that, and that's where communication is harmonious. Because if I have the space to come to you and say, hey, I'm hurting, and this is what the hurt is, then I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. Because maybe I'm not trying to hurt you in that fashion with my behavior. And maybe it's now, then I can look at my life and be like, okay, I can tell the truth. Yeah, I can see how that can hurt you. It may not hurt me, but I can see how this hurts you. So now, am I going to be negotiable, or am I going to be like, well, I don't care if that hurts you? Like, so then now that's a different conversation. And like you say, we should have those conversations before we put up these protective emotional protections in our words, because it's really in our language. Because even if I put this boundary up from you, I'm still going to go back in the next 10 minutes. Now I got this thing in my space that's uncommunicated to you. And every time you act a certain way, I'm going to do my boundary.
Right.
So now you got to live like that.
Right. And I know Brittany's a good communicator. And I know it was a great opportunity to look at that word hurting, because sometimes when we try to have those conversations with people, we're quick to use those big words and without really breaking it down and understanding how we feel. Well, meanwhile, we're expecting the other person to understand how we feel, and we don't even know how we feel.
And no, yes, that was my point, Brittany. That's how I was expressing how we use words to describe our life. That may not be the perfect word to describe our life in that moment. So
right. It's interesting to think about a lot of I think we're going to, over the next 4 episodes, we're going to get into a lot of different aspects of boundaries, and I'm looking forward to this because I think it's necessary. It's necessary because ultimately I think every single episode is going to come down to knowing yourself and communication. If there's somebody else involved, that last episode that we do is going to be really about the self and the limits and the boundaries that we put on ourselves, and healthy versus unhealthy and all of that. But a lot of this, there's other people involved. There's other people involved. All right, good friend Danielle. By the way, shout out Danielle if you're watching. I saw a story she posted yesterday of somebody talking about boundaries. She must have known this episode was coming on today. But somebody was talking about boundaries, and I loved how she was describing it, because ultimately for me, and I've talked about this on the show before, I love really hard. I love really hard. So when it's something I can't even describe, Veron. I can't describe it. I love so hard that I can't even describe it. It is, I don't know. I stumble because it's something that I can't, it's something outside of me. I'll just say that. It's got to be something outside of me.
Maybe for an episode of love.
But oh Jesus, I'm gonna be absent for that one. I'm gonna be absent because it's hard. That's a hard one.
Around here.
Because I can just tell you feels what it feels like. It feels like a delicious chocolate candy bar and cake and fresh air and the ocean waves.
Oh, ocean waves? Oh,
and glitter and unicorns and Care Bears, lots of Care Bears. Listen, okay.
I love y'all.
Y'all know how I feel about the Care Bears.
Care Bears, I love y'all. If you got a Care Bear in your heart,
Caroline is a place we all. Okay, anyway.
You love hard if you.
All right, listen, I love hard. So what is my point? My point. My point is that you can when you this is what I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
When you hear the word boundaries, does that feel loving to you?
No.
See, that's where we differ. That's where we differ.
Guard it. It's a guard. To me, it's right off the top boundary, and maybe it's my military mindset. Maybe it's me being a man or whatever that is, but. You talk about boundaries. You're talking about protecting yourself.
Go ahead. Stay right there. Go.
You're talking about protecting yourself. And you're talking about keeping people away from you. And so, with boundaries, there's a physical aspect of it, and there's an emotional aspect. And the emotional aspect of it, you have to find the best words to utilize that experience that you're feeling in that moment. And I believe if you do that, then the boundaries, you wouldn't have to even use the word boundaries. You wouldn't even have to say boundaries if you just communicated. There's no reason to say these are my boundaries. No, I'm communicating, and these are non-negotiable or whatever that is. But what episode are we going to talk about where the boundaries impact us? Is that this episode?
Well, I think some of that's going to tie into when we talk about relationships, because ultimately, so that's next week, and then the fourth week as well, because that's going to be the boundaries we create for ourselves. But I had to go get my friend. Because I found it. I found exactly
Oh my!
why.
Which
I
Care Bear?
found
Which Care Bear?
exactly why
Which Care
you
Bear?
and I have a different perspective on boundaries.
Which Care Bear is this?
My bell.
Oh my!
It was a light bulb moment. It was a light bulb moment here because that's where our perspective differs on boundaries. Boundaries to me is a loving limit that we can create. I can create a boundary and say, so and so, no, you cannot slap me in the face. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that. I don't want to be slapped in the face, but I love you and I wish you well.
And that's
you
about
do not. Absolutely. We can
physical aspect, of course. No, I mean, and if a person who loves you would not slap you anyway, so that's the person
but it doesn't. Love doesn't have to be a two-way street, Farron. Love does not have to be. There's a lot of people that I love that cannot effing stand me, but I love them and I wish them well. Will I invite them over to my house? No, that's my boundary. Okay. But I can love you and wish you well without. There doesn't have to be a wall. Doesn't mean hatred. And I think even as I'm going to get a little controversial here for a moment. Okay. Even as we talk about certain physical boundaries, okay, that certain people have wanted to create in certain countries, all right, I think that's why people get upset about these boundaries that want to be these walls, because they see that wall as an act of hatred when really it doesn't have to be hate. You can love someone on the other side of that damn wall.
Yeah. So when you again, so I'm listening to you as you describe the boundaries and love and connect those two together. For me, it goes back to, I filter that through, you know what? It's how I think about you. I can love you and not have to be around you or be your friend. The freedom is how I think about you.
And that's a boundary.
Right. But I'm saying, if I create that boundary as I gotta get away from you because of the physical aspect, right? And the boundary comes up from, okay, I love you, but I'm not gonna talk to you. Then you're still putting that, you're still carrying the weight of that relationship.
Not necessarily. Because have you ever, what's that saying that people say? If you love them, you let them go.
Yeah, that's a cliche.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. If you love yourself, sometimes you got to let them go. And if you love them, you can let them go. And it has, now look, there are those situations like you're talking about where it's a hasty boundary. There's no resolve, there's no healing, it is putting up a wall, period, end of story. But if you can absolutely, I see boundaries as an undeniable act of self-love and the ability to continue to love other people while you're still loving yourself, while you're still protecting yourself, while you're still having that self-respect. Sometimes about self-respect, self-love, self-worth, all of that.
Nothing to do with that has nothing to do with anybody else, though.
Right. That's to do with yourself.
Yeah.
But
that's you. So
right.
The self-love, I'm looking at it, from the heart of people. And at the end of the day, we do love one another naturally, right? We do love one another. But then also we think about one another in some crazy ways. We think about one another. I could think about you, but the thinking of it is more harmful than me saying it to you. Because it's the heart of it's what's in your subconscious mind. And if those boundaries are in your subconscious mind, deep rooted as a guard, it's blocking more than just the boundary I set up against you, guaranteed. It's holding me back in other areas of my life other than just what happened in that one relationship. And that's how we carry all that stuff. We baggage, boundaries, however you want to call them, but they're not physical, they're emotional. And so to be free from that relationship is for me to take 100% responsibility that, you know what, I love you, and you know what, we're going to complete this relationship because these are the consequences of your behavior, and these consequences are non-negotiable to me. And I've told you this when we first got together, so you shouldn't be surprised. This shouldn't be new, right? But do we have those conversations in the beginning? Do we screen that relationship in the beginning before we become friends and get emotionally attached to one another? There's a lot of conversations we don't have.
Right.
So now we're having them now because you crossed one of my boundaries and you didn't know you was crossing it. And so I'm going to tell it. So it's like all of that, but it's all in our heads.
Right.
It's all in our hearts. It's all deep rooted. You know, I'm carrying boundaries from 5 years old that I discovered like, oh shoot, I got to let that go because it's not only hindering that relationship with my mom or my dad. That boundary represents people's behavior. And when it looks like that is about to happen to me, let me go get that boundary because I got to put this up. And I don't even know if you was about to do the same thing that happened to me that caused that boundary to be created.
Right.
And so that's why I say it's more, boundaries to me are more emotionally, and then we describe them as physical aspects, but they're more emotionally charged than anything. And we have feelings and emotions, and we don't have to become them. We have feelings and emotions, and I don't have to become that feeling or emotion. So you can't make me mad. You can't make me put up a boundary for you. You can't make me do that. If I'm doing it, that means I'm protecting myself from maybe my own self. Because if you cross that boundary, I'm gonna knock you out, or I'm gonna punch you, I'm gonna slap. Like, so what am I protecting myself from on the other side of that boundary as well? And to disappear those boundaries gives me the freedom to just be. And like I said, if something happens between us, at least I have the confidence to say, hey, did I say something to you? Did I do something? Because you acting different. Right. Did I say something? And then give you an opportunity to say, hey, yeah, you know what? You hurt me today. How did I hurt you? And now we can talk about it. There's no boundary.
No, I disagree. I disagree wholeheartedly because I think that there's absolutely still a boundary in place. Okay, but you're choosing to communicate as part of that boundary, and you're also choosing not to turn that boundary into baggage, which that's where that freedom comes from.
Boundaries into baggage.
Boundaries into baggage. You can have loving, non-baggage carrying boundaries. And what?
How many boundaries do you have?
A lot.
Exactly.
A lot. I have a lot of boundaries, but they're not, but it's my choice day in and day out, whether those things are a focus, what type of boundaries they are, whether there's something that's going to make me carry around things like guilt and anger and resentment, sadness, that feeling of feeling left out, like, it's my choice. There's a lot of choice that comes into play when it comes to boundaries. And it's also my responsibility, which is the big word that I wanted to touch on. And you touched on it briefly, Farron, and that's that we get into a lot of relationships, in that honeymoon, it's so yummy and great and wonderful. And we're gonna let that one slide, and we'll let that one slide, and go ahead and keep walking all over my carpet here. Like, I just, it's interesting with that, because now I tend to be a little bit more vocal when I'm in a relationship with someone. I will be like, no, No is a whole sentence, folks. And I don't, as opposed to when I was younger, I don't let little things slide here and there anymore. And then, like, my husband and I, we had a lot of conversations before we actually got married. A lot of conversations that I didn't have the first time around. Now, I'm not blaming myself for the abuse that happened. I am not blaming myself for the infidelity that happened. I am not blaming myself for any of that. But I will take responsibility for the fact that I did not have enough conversation with that man before we got married.
Yeah. And that's what we do.
I will take responsibility for that part because I didn't. And that's not to say, I want to be very clear and say that's not to say that you can have 8 million conversations with someone and they just can't snap, because sometimes that happens. Yeah. But I'm talking about my own situation. I did not have enough conversation. And that's something that I think we take for granted a lot, and we don't do often enough. I'm talking outside of love relationships. We don't do enough in business relationships. We don't do it enough in friendships. We don't do it enough with our children.
Definitely. Those beings. Definitely
Yeah.
those. Yeah, so I mean, so like I said, I'm walking away today. Like, I know we use the word boundaries. I know people still, maybe I don't have to use them, but I do understand what I got from you today is that boundary could create a level of confidence and courage and to stand from. And that's cool. I like that gave me some peace, because I like that. If that's what gives you the confidence to stand for yourself, right? To recognize your self-love, I could see that being something to stand on. But we got to understand that also what it does to us in our own integrity and where it's coming from. Right. And if it's coming from a context of me trying to protect myself emotionally, you might need to check that out, because you're giving that person still your power to put up a boundary around from them. They still, to me, you're giving energy and force to keep that boundary in your mind in place. And you can't tell me that's taking some energy, that's taking some thoughts to remind you. So your subconscious mind reminding you, oh, don't forget, we got this boundary over here for that. We got this boundary over here for that. We got this boundary. And now you're like living your life through boundaries. So how are you self-expressed? How are you free to just be yourself and just live a life? It's a survival state. And our spirit wants to live and be free, and our subconscious mind is like, nope, we need to survive life so we don't die.
I would say if you created that boundary without love, and you created that boundary about the other person and not about yourself and where you're at and where you need to be and self-love and self-worth and all of that stuff, then you're going to be carrying around a lot of stuff that's going to turn the boundary into baggage. Like, I'm going to trademark that. I'm gonna trademark, okay? Because we're gonna do it because that's what happens when we don't take responsibility for the boundaries that we are creating. And I'm excited to get into that in the next several episodes. So I think it's gonna be good.
Thank you. You gave me another perspective of boundaries that I was
were hell-bent.
I was that they don't exist, but I could see how they can exist to give a person power and strength. So yeah, for sure. I have a little bit of more compassion.
All it takes is my friend the Care Bears. Okay.
Yeah. As a soldier with a mindset like mine, I don't do boundaries no more, because they will be devastating. Nobody's getting in. and I'm not getting out either.
You're still doing boundaries, but you're doing healthy boundaries now. You're doing thoughtful, loving, self-reflective boundaries, Farron. You just gotta flip. So I'm gonna flip this by the end.
I need to come to the other side of the boundary where you are, so I can see what the other side looks like, because this side right here doesn't look like that. What are you looking at on the other side?
Listen, I want to thank everybody for watching or listening wherever you are. And we would love to continue this conversation on boundaries. Next episode, we're going to be talking about specifically those boundaries within personal relationships. We're going to be discussing the challenges of maintaining healthy boundaries while fostering meaningful connections and relationships. So we'll see what that looks like. Because for Ron, you was definitely being stubborn. Okay.
Now I gotta do more research.
And then the following ones, like we talked about, we're going to talk about cultural boundaries and embracing diversity. Maybe we can get Caldwell come back on for that. You think that'd be fun?
Yeah.
And then that was just live here on the show. Anyway, then the final one, we're going to talk about pushing limits and those self-imposed boundaries and maybe what we can do to move forward, because sometimes when we dig our heels in, it's not the most healthy thing for us. Okay. So we're going to talk about that too. Thank you guys for being here. We appreciate you and love you so much. And we'll be back in 2 weeks for more Beyond 2D. I'm Jessica Dugas, and this is
Farron Dozier. Peace.
See you next time, everybody. Bye.